Hello, I hope my experience is to your liking. I worked as a forest ranger in a small, remote wooded area a couple of years ago. The forest was dense, with towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Their trunks were so thick and tall that you had to crane your neck just to see the tops. My job mostly involved routine tasks, patrolling trails, monitoring wildlife, and ensuring the safety of visitors. Most of my experiences were uneventful, like running into a bear or helping a lost hiker. But what I'm about to tell you was far from ordinary. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. The forest had an eerie stillness to it, especially at night. The trees seemed to whisper secrets to one another, and the shadows danced in ways that made you question your sanity. I've always believed in ghosts. Throughout my life, I've had a few encounters, but they've always been peaceful, like a faint figure in the distance or a soft voice calling my name. Those experiences never scared me. Instead, they made me reflect on the afterlife and the mysteries of the world. But what I experienced that day was different. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't reflective. It was pure, unrelenting terror. It happened on a quiet afternoon. I was wandering through the woods, as I often did. The surveillance station could feel suffocating after hours of sitting alone, so I'd go out for walks to clear my head. I always took the same route along the same trails, so I knew the area like the back of my hand. That day, I was in a part of the forest that had nothing special, just trees so tall that they seemed to touch the clouds. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. As I walked, my eye caught something on the trunk of one of the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear or a large bird. But as I got closer, I realized it was something much bigger. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it clearly. It was a man. He was overweight, completely naked, and clinging to the trunk at the top of the tree. His arms and legs were wrapped around it as if he were hugging it. His face was turned away, so I couldn't see it clearly, but something about him felt wrong. The toes of his feet and hands looked like they were stuck in the bark, as if he had somehow fused with the tree. I yelled at him to get down from there, but he didn't respond. My voice echoed through the forest, but the man remained motionless. I called out to him again and again, my voice growing louder and more desperate, but he didn't move. He didn't even flinch. Annoyed and bewildered, I walked closer, determined to see his face. What I saw made my blood run cold. The man had a gaping hole in his face, as if he had shot himself with a shotgun. The entire front of his face was gone, leaving a hollow, bloody cavity. His skin was pale and lifeless, and his body looked unnaturally stiff. For a moment, I stood frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. Was this some kind of prank? A hallucination? But the longer I stared, the more I realized this was real. This was no living man. Fear surged through me and I turned to run. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted through the forest, my boots crunching against the dry leaves. I didn't look back. Couldn't. After a minute of running, I stopped and leaned against a tree to catch my breath. My legs felt like jelly, and my hands were trembling. As I tried to calm myself, my eyes caught something else. Another figure. This one was on top of a different tree, hugging it just like the first man. But this one was thinner, almost skeletal. His skin clung to his bones, and his limbs looked unnaturally long. I didn't stop to inspect him. I didn't want to see his face. I ran again, this time keeping my eyes on the ground. I didn't dare look up. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending as if they were alive. When I finally reached the surveillance station, I locked myself in and called a companion who was stationed in another sector. My voice trembled as I begged him to come to me. I felt like a child, terrified of the dark. I had never seen something so violent and unsettling. What scared me the most was the realization that those beings were ghosts. Poor souls trapped in this world for reasons I couldn't comprehend. My companion arrived an hour later, and together we searched the area. But there was no sign of the Faceless Men. The trees were empty, and the forest was eerily quiet. Since that day, I've never ventured too far from the station during my patrols. I've also stopped looking at the tops of the trees. Every time I pass by that part of the forest, I feel a chill run down my spine. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. Were they lost souls trapped in the forest? Or something more sinister? I don't know. But I do know that I'll never forget the faceless men in the trees. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. This is an anecdote that a friend of mine told me. I met him during some CPR courses, and he works as a forest ranger. When we attended the courses, he had only been working in that role for a couple of months. Despite his short time on the job, he had already experienced something that I'm sure he will never forget. According to him, this happened during one of his routine patrols in a dense, remote forest. The forest he works in is vast and largely untouched by humans. It's filled with towering trees, winding trails, and a small river that cuts through the heart of the woods. The river serves as the boundary for his patrols, and he's not allowed to go beyond it. One evening, as he was finishing his last patrol of the day, the sun began to set. During winter, the days are shorter, and darkness falls quickly. By the time he reached the river, the forest was already cloaked in shadows. He carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as he scanned the area. The river was calm, its surface reflecting the faint light of the moon. He did a quick sweep of the surroundings, checking for anything unusual. Finding nothing out of the ordinary, he turned around and began his walk back to his hut. But then something stopped him. He heard a splash nearby. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon coming to drink from the river. But as he listened, the sound didn't seem natural. It was too deliberate, too human. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate. With his flashlight in hand, he cautiously approached the source of the sound. The beam of light danced across the riverbank, illuminating the trees and rocks. And then he saw her. The creature was a woman, or at least something that resembled a woman. She was naked, her skin pale and almost translucent in the moonlight. Her body was unnaturally thin, her ribs visible beneath her skin. But what stood out the most was her height. She was sitting by the river, her long, tangled hair reaching the ground. Her arms and legs were abnormally long, her fingers and toes almost claw-like. She was hunched over, her face hidden by her hair as she cupped water from the river in her hands. My friend froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Then, she turned her head. The beam of his flashlight caught her face, and for a split second, he saw her eyes. They were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare right through him. He doesn't remember what the rest of her face looked like because he didn't stay long enough to see. Terrified, he turned and ran. He didn't look back. He didn't care where he was going. All he knew was that he had to get away from her. But in his panic, he didn't pay attention to his surroundings. The forest, which was already difficult to navigate during the day, became a labyrinth of shadows and twisted trees. He was lost. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He stopped running, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound being the pounding of his heart. He tried to calm himself, to think clearly, but the image of the woman, or whatever she was, kept flashing in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching him, waiting for him. Those minutes felt like hours. He wandered aimlessly, his flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made him jump. He was convinced that she was following him, her long limbs dragging her through the darkness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he found his way back to the trail. Relief washed over him as he recognized the familiar path leading to his hut. He didn't stop running until he was safely inside, the door locked behind him. He didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made him flinch, and he kept his flashlight close, just in case. The next morning, he returned to the river with a group of fellow rangers. They searched the area, but there was no sign of the woman. No footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing. To this day, he doesn't know what he saw. Was she a ghost? A witch? Or something else entirely? He doesn't have the answers. All he knows is that the experience left him shaken. My friend says that if he didn't love his job so much, he would have quit after that night. But despite the fear, he continues to patrol the forest, always keeping a wary eye on the river. He hasn't seen her since, but he knows she's still out there, and he prays that he never has to face her again. The experience I'm about to tell you happened to my grandfather when he was young. He had been hired to patrol a forest near the estate of a wealthy family. The funny thing is, the reason they hired him was nothing more and nothing less than to look for ghosts. At first, my grandfather, who was very young at the time, didn't fully understand why they would hire him for such a strange job. But the truth was, his parents worked as servants for the wealthy family, and as an act of kindness, they hired their son, my grandfather, to earn some money. He had a theory that since there wasn't much else useful to do on the farm, they gave him this so-called ghost hunting job as a way to pay him without making it seem like charity. He accepted eagerly, excited to finally have money of his own. But he never imagined that the job would turn out to be anything but meaningless. The family explained to him that his duty would be to look for the ghosts that screamed. Yes, you heard that right, screaming ghosts. It was well known that in that forest, there were beings that would let out blood-curdling screams during the day. These weren't just random noises. They were 1 to 5 distinct screams that echoed through the trees at any time, for no apparent reason. This phenomenon had been happening intermittently for decades. In fact, my grandfather and his parents had already heard these screams before. Skeptics believed they were just the cries of lost hikers or mentally unstable people wandering the woods. But the wealthy family, who had owned the land for generations, were convinced it was something more. They had sent people into the forest countless times to investigate, but no one had ever found anything. So, my grandfather's job was simple: walk through the forest almost all day and track the screams to their origin, if they ever happened. For many weeks, he wandered through the woods, hoping to hear the infamous screams. At first, it seemed like the best job in the world. He was paid well, and all he had to do was walk around and wait for something to happen. But as the days turned into weeks, he started to get bored. What began as an exciting adventure soon became monotonous. Instead of staying alert throughout his patrols, he started to slack off. He found a comfortable spot in the forest and would often fall asleep, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then one day it did. A scream, not too far away, jolted him out of his sleep. It was a scream so terrified and full of pain that it sent chills down his spine. He immediately jumped to his feet, his heart racing. The scream was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't just loud. It was raw, filled with agony, as if someone was being tortured. He sharpened his hearing, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It didn't take him long to figure out where it was coming from. He began to run, knowing that the screams never lasted more than a few minutes. If he didn't hurry, he would miss his chance to find their source. The screams grew louder as he ran, echoing through the trees. They sounded as if someone was dying right there, in the heart of the forest. The pain in the voice was palpable, and it made my grandfather's stomach churn. When he finally reached the spot where the screams were coming from, he stopped dead in his tracks. The forest was eerily silent. There was no one there, no sign of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. It was as if the screams had come from thin air. My grandfather stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes scanning the area. He knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't the work of lost hikers or crazy people. This was something else entirely. Determined to find answers, he began to search the surroundings. It didn't take long for him to find something that made his blood run cold. Near some tree trunks, partially buried in the dirt, were human bones. Everything began to make a horrifying kind of sense. The screams, the legends, the decades of unanswered questions. It all pointed to something dark and sinister. My grandfather gathered the remains and took them back to the family's estate. At first, the family was skeptical. Who wouldn't be? But as they examined the bones and listened to my grandfather's story, they began to believe him. His mission continued for many more months. He chased the screams as best he could, determined to uncover the truth. In the end, he managed to find 5 different sites where human remains were buried. Each time, he brought the bones back to the family, who arranged for them to be given a proper, holy burial. And then, something incredible happened. The screaming stopped. The phenomenon that had plagued the forest for decades. The screams that had terrified so many ceased. It was as if the spirits had finally found peace. To this day, my grandfather doesn't know who those people were or why they were buried in the forest. But he believes that his work helped put their souls to rest. The forest, once known as the Forest of Screams, is now quiet, but my grandfather never forgot the terror he felt that day, or the chilling sound of those agonized screams. My name is Carlos. Some time ago, I worked as a park ranger in a national park in the state of Pennsylvania. I am Mexican, but I have U.S. nationality since I married a woman from here. My first formal job was that one. We lived on the outskirts of Pennsylvania, where it is practically pure forest. I had the job of taking care of a large part of those forests because many people usually go camping there. The area has a lot of vegetation and incredible views. I had to maintain order in the place and also verify that there were no lost or endangered people. The forest is very large, and many people have gotten lost there. Some never returned. I have many anecdotes from that forest, but I consider this one by far the most terrifying and grotesque. It all started in 2007, when the number of missing people in that forest began to increase. I started working as a park ranger that same year. I had another partner who had been in that job for several years. He was my boss at that time, and he told me about his concern regarding the increase in missing people. Even with search teams, we never found any traces of those people. So, I had a very big responsibility. I remember that one of those days, I was taking a round through the forest with my dog. He was also trained to track people. I started walking for a long time, and when I realized, I was already out of my work area. I didn't notice when I went so deep into the forest. It was still daylight, but the sunlight barely entered through the tall trees and their huge branches. I wasn't scared because I knew the place and how to get back. What alarmed me was that my dog started to bark and walk desperately in one direction, pulling on his leash. It almost slipped out of my hands. I followed his trail. He was sniffing the ground and barked more and more. He doesn't bark like that unless he has detected something. That's why he was behaving that way. So, I kept walking where my dog was leading me. Suddenly, we got to a very hidden part of the forest. We were already too far away and deep in that place. It was a spot where the sun's rays almost didn't enter. It seemed like nighttime there. At the bottom, almost imperceptible to the human eye, there was a very small cave. What disturbed me was that on the outside, it had the words "Free Hugs" written in paint. My dog was out of control, barking very desperately, wanting to get into the cave. I took out my gun and very slowly began to approach to see what was inside. My dog was restless, so I had to turn on my flashlight because it was completely dark in there. When I did, I could see a large amount of what looked like human bones scattered throughout the cave, along with a nauseating, almost unbearable smell. I couldn't get to the bottom of that deep cave because I knew I had to notify the police. I didn't want to stain what seemed to be a crime scene. My radio didn't work because there was no signal in that place. So, I had to go back to use my radio and report what had happened. Soon, the place was filled with police. They entered the cave and found what I had told them. Remains of human bones, some clothes, broken cell phones, and other personal items of those poor people. We still didn't know who or what they had been victims of. At first, there was talk of some animal, but that was immediately ruled out. When they got to the depths of the cave, they found an old and dirty cot, along with a mattress in very bad condition. There were also many knives of different shapes and sizes. On the wall, there were scribbles or writings that were not understood. So, we immediately knew that the person or people who caused the crimes were human. That was when the search began to find the alleged perpetrators of all those deaths. All the remains were analyzed, and they turned out to be from all those people who had disappeared in that forest. What most caught the attention of the police was that some of those people had disappeared just days ago, and their bodies were already completely bare bones. So, there was also talk that the person or people responsible were cannibals. The search lasted for days, but there was no trace of the culprits. The police decided to leave cameras in different points of that area and leave the place empty again. They hoped the culprits would feel safe to return to their lair, if you could call it that. That's what they did. The first few days, there was no sign of anyone. But one night, you could see on one of the cameras a couple of people, if you could call them that. They didn't seem completely human. They walked as if they were apes, and their faces were disfigured, as if they were some kind of mutants. It was seen how they entered the cave. Immediately, all the armed police arrived, pointing towards the cave. They had them cornered. They told them to come out with their hands up, but no one came out. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the man came running, attacking one of the officers in a very savage way. They had to shoot him, but he didn't die. Then, they went in for the woman and took both of them to the county jail. They tried to interrogate them, but neither of the two knew how to speak. They communicated with signs and didn't know how to act. It was very difficult for the agents to interrogate them, but it was proven that they were responsible for all the disappearances and deaths of those victims. So, they put them in maximum security prison. It was also discovered that they had taken a can of paint from the belongings of one of the victims and had written "free hugs" on their cave to attract people. According to them, they had somehow learned that phrase from people. It was also proven that they spied on their victims and tried to study them before hunting them. They were like monsters. All of that made people stop going camping for a while. After that, I was afraid to do my rounds through the forest because it was not known if more of them were out there. The truth is, it's something we will never know. Maybe there are more deep in the forest where no one has ever arrived. Those forests are immense, and after a certain area, it is prohibited to pass through because of the animals that live there and the risk of getting lost. I lasted a few more years in that job and then retired. But without a doubt, this is a story that I will continue to tell, even with fear, for the rest of my life. This story happened to me when I was working as a forest ranger in a very famous forest in Veracruz. This was many years ago, and it is just one of the 1,000 paranormal anecdotes that happened to me in that place. The forest is popular among tourists because it is characterized by the fog that is always present. It can be a little spooky, but for many, it adds to the beauty of the place. However, the fog also lends itself to paranormal occurrences. On one occasion, there was a bachelorette party in one of the cabins inside the forest. We received a call from one of the girls in that cabin because they said they had seen a man spying on them from outside. They asked us to send someone immediately. It was my turn to go check. I arrived at the cabin, which was the only one inhabited that night. I knocked on the door, and the 5 young women staying there came out. They told me they were outside the cabin, drinking and talking, when suddenly they heard footsteps coming from the trees. They turned around immediately but didn't see anything at first. They thought it was just an animal. But after several minutes, 2 of them saw a man watching them from behind a tree with a huge smile. The girls screamed, and the others turned around. They also saw the silhouette standing behind the tree, with the bright smile that allowed them to decipher it was a person. They immediately ran to take shelter in the cabin. After a short time, they saw the same man pass by the window with the same smile. They were very scared. When they told me everything, they asked me to please check the surroundings and stop that person. It was only the first night they would spend there, and they didn't want to leave. I told them not to worry and that I would check the whole area. I told them to lock themselves in and that I would let them know when I stopped the suspect. I withdrew and began the search, going deeper into the forest. It was already getting dark, and the fog was present. Honestly, I never got used to that. It always seemed scary to me. I turned on my flashlight and began to check the area. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Very slow footsteps. I turned around immediately, and there I saw him. Between the fog and the trees, it was the silhouette of a very tall man. What stood out the most was his bright smile, very big and macabre. When I pointed the flashlight at him, he disappeared. It seemed like he was a shadow. I asked him, "Who are you? What are you doing here? This is a private area." But he didn't answer. He just kept that smile from ear to ear. I repeated that he had to get out of there, but from one moment to the next, that figure began to walk towards me. In no time did he stop smiling. I began to walk backward, and to be honest, I was terrified. I had nothing to defend myself with. I told him not to come any closer, but it seemed like he didn't even listen. The closer he got, the more horrifying his smile became. When I realized the guy, or thing, was coming for me, I ran away without looking back. I was so terrified that when I tried to call for help on the radio, I dropped it on the ground. I didn't want to look back and just kept running. Some time passed, and I suddenly stopped. When I turned around, that man was no longer there. There was no one else. I began to panic when I noticed I didn't know where I was. I hadn't realized how far into the forest I had gone. Without looking at where I was going, I ended up lost. I began to walk for a while, trying to get to a place I could recognize, but everything I saw was new to me. It got completely dark. It was just me and my flashlight against this imposing forest at night, and, well, also against that thing I knew was somewhere. The only thing that gave me hope was that the girls and my superior knew where I was. If I didn't show up in a few hours, they would send for me. So I tried to stay calm, but that calm was totally interrupted when I turned around to look behind me. There was a very large tree full of what seemed to be people hanging on ropes, already lifeless. At the bottom of that tree, he was standing with that same smile he had since the beginning. He was watching me, seeing how I trembled with fear. I know he liked it. He enjoyed seeing me terrified. I began to walk backward, still in shock. I tripped on a stone and my flashlight fell. When I picked it up and pointed it toward the tree again, it was no longer there. The people hanging were gone, and it seemed like I had imagined everything. But I know what I saw. The man, or whatever it was, had also disappeared. So, I began to run again without a fixed direction because I still didn't know where I was. Finally, I saw in the distance the light of a flashlight. I felt like my soul was returning to my body. I ran as fast as I could toward that light. It was my superior who, with another partner, had gone to look for me. I told them everything that had happened, hoping they would make fun of me and not believe me. But it was the opposite. They had also seen it. And not only that, but many other strange apparitions and unusual noises that were not from animals. My boss mentioned that the forest had a lot of history, including some tragic events that happened there due to crime. So, it seemed normal to him that these kinds of paranormal things occurred. As for the girls, they left the next day. After that event, it was logical that they were afraid. After that, it was very strange for the cabins to have people. Almost nobody rented them because of the many things that happened in that place. I no longer work there, but I wonder if there are still brave people who dare to stay in that forest. My name is Luis. I was a forest ranger in the state of Oaxaca. It was a tourist area, so my job consisted of ensuring the safety of the people. This story begins when one day, my colleague and I received an alert. Our radios told us that there was a missing tourist in the area, a young man who was camping with his friends. We were asked to look for him within the area where those people were camping. There wasn't much staff, but they told us that if he didn't appear that day, they would call the police to begin the search with more equipment. We were asked to find him because they didn't want the situation to escalate. It sounds ugly, but what mattered most to them was that it wouldn't reach the media and give the place a bad reputation. So my partner and I started the search. It wasn't within the area allowed for tourists. We went through the whole area until it started to get dark. We reported to our superiors that we hadn't found him, but they asked us to leave that area. They said perhaps the young man had left there drunk and gotten lost. We obeyed and went deeper into the immense forest. It was imposing because that area was really dangerous due to the animals that lived there, especially at night. I didn't realize how long we walked, but suddenly, we arrived at a stream. On the other side, we saw a small wooden house, very old and in poor condition. You could see light, like from a campfire, inside it. Suddenly, the fog made itself present. My partner told me we should cross the stream to investigate that house. I said yes, but we would have to walk to find the lowest point of the water since it was dangerous because of the current. So that's what we did. We began to walk along the bank of that small river when suddenly, we saw a lady in the water. She had a black dress, but we couldn't see her face well because of the fog. At first, we thought she was taking a bath because she was throwing water with what seemed to be a container. But the closer we got, we saw something that stunned us. What she was throwing wasn't water, it was blood. When we saw that, I stopped my partner and made a sign for him to be quiet. I didn't want that woman to notice we were there. We walked as stealthily as we could, hiding behind a tree to watch her. She was an elderly woman who smiled while she threw all that liquid on her face and body. My partner asked me very slowly, "What do we do?" I answered that we had to leave. The situation was very disturbing. But then my radio rang. It was my superior asking if we had found anything. At that moment, the woman suddenly turned toward us with eyes of fury. She knew perfectly well that we were behind that tree. We were sweating, terrified. But suddenly, a heartbreaking male scream was heard coming from that house. The old woman turned around and immediately began to run with impressive speed toward what seemed to be her house. My partner told me, "It's time. Let's get out of here." But I couldn't leave knowing there was someone there who needed help. That scream was full of pain, and I knew it could be the missing tourist. So I told him, "Go. You leave. I'll stay and find out what's inside that house." He asked me if I was crazy and said it would be better if we left and came back with help. But something inside me didn't allow me to leave that person alone, who was probably a victim of that lady. So I stayed. My partner ran away, and I decided to cross the river. I found a place where the water reached my knees, and I crossed to the other side. I walked crouched toward that house because I didn't want the old woman to see me. When I was about to arrive, I heard the scream of pain again, more horrible than anything I had ever heard in my life. When I got to the window, I could see a young man tied hand and foot to what seemed to be a bar. The most disturbing thing was that the old woman was making cuts on his body and filling a wooden container with blood. I was shaking. My whole body felt tense, and I didn't know what to do. I looked around the place, and it was disgusting. There were animal remains all over the house and an old hammock where it seemed the lady slept, or whatever she was. I ran away immediately because I didn't have the courage to face that dark woman. I was sure she was a witch. I always believed in those things, and I know they are real. So I decided to run away and wait for the help my partner had gone to ask for. I crossed the stream again, but when I was on the other side, I heard the horrible laughter of that woman. She was standing on the other side of the river, watching me and mocking me. Her face was stained with blood, as were her hands and clothes. It was a disturbing image that still haunts me. I ran out, screaming in fear. I ran without stopping until I reached the tourist area. There, my partner was with 3 police officers who were going to look for the young man. I told them I thought the young man was the one I had seen in that house and that he needed help. I urged them to hurry. I no longer wanted to return to that place, but I had to because my partner didn't remember the way. So, with great fear, I returned with the officers to the place. But when we got there, the house had disappeared. How was that possible? There was no trace of the small house, the woman, or the young man. The officers doubted what I had told them and asked me many times if I was sure of what I had seen. I no longer knew how to tell them it was real. My partner also told them he had seen the house and the woman, but we never found anything. We walked all over that place. We even crossed the river, but there wasn't a single trace that there had ever been a house or building. There were only trees and branches. Everything was too confusing and scary. For days, I couldn't go to work. My wife was the only one who believed my story because she also believes in witchcraft. I never left the tourist area again, and they never found out what happened to that missing young tourist. The news became public, but since back then there were no social networks, it didn't go viral as it would now. I just want to tell you that evil witches do exist. They are evil people who have pacts with other evil beings and can destroy lives. Be very careful.